strength and weakness. Even though we may feel weak and unworthy, we should be available to God to use us in miraculous ways to achieve His purposes in this world. Here's Gene to explain.
Background to this is there was a siege against Israel again by the king of Aram. There was a horrible famine that was taking place. It really focused in the city of Samaria, where King Jehoram, who, by the way, was a son of Ahab, was ruler. He was an evil king within Israel. But as you read the story, you see that the Lord delivered them from this famine by bringing judgment on the hordes from Aram. So we see, again, incredible grace being demonstrated in the midst of this very difficult situation. And it's fascinating that you find in the Old Testament that God will bring judgment on His people for the evil they've done, and then He will turn around, extend grace to His people, and bring judgment on the enemies of Israel. God is in control, and He works these things out in incredible ways. So that sets the stage then for 2 Kings chapter 7 and verse 3 and following, where we have strength being illustrated in weakness. Here's what we read in verse 3. 4 men with a skin disease, probably leprosy, 4 men with a skin disease were at the entrance to the gate, that is, to the gate of the city of Samaria. And they said to each other, "Why just sit here until we die?" They were in an incredible catch-22. And they felt like they were doomed to die either way. So they said, "Why just sit here until we die? If we say, 'Let's go into the city,' that is, into the city of Samaria, where horrible things were happening in terms of starvation, we will die there because the famine is in the city. But if we sit here outside the gate, we'll also die. So now, come on," the 4 of them said to each other. "Let's go to the Arameans' camp. Let's go right into the middle of our enemies. If they let us live, we'll live. They might have mercy on us. If they kill us, we will die, but we're going to die regardless." So the diseased men got up at twilight to go to the Arameans' camp. And when they came to the camp's edge, they discovered that there was not a single man there in that camp. Why? Well, the text goes on to explain. For the Lord had caused the Aramean camp to hear the sound of chariots, horses, and a great army. Now that's fascinating, because maybe that was a spiritual army. Maybe this was not just a figment of imagination and noise. It doesn't say they saw what Elisha's servant saw, but it would be very easy for God to allow the sound of chariots, the sound of horses, the sound of a great army. Perhaps this was the unseen world, again being revealed. We're not told. Regardless, God was at work. The Arameans had said to each other, "The king of Israel must have hired the kings of the Hittites, the kings of Egypt to attack us." They believed that this was real. It was real, but it wasn't visible. It was audible, but not visible. So they had gotten up and they fled at twilight, abandoning their tents, their horses, their donkeys. The camp was intact and they had fled for their lives. They left everything. Now what happened is the 4 guys, diseased men, went into the camp and began to hoard all this to themselves. And then they were overcome with guilt because they realized that there were a lot of people back in the city that were starving. And they too ought to have access to this. So that picks up with the rest of the story. The diseased men went and called to the city's gatekeepers and told them, "We went to the Aramean camp and no one was there." Would you believe? No one was there. No human sounds. There was nothing but tethered horses and donkeys, and the tents were intact. It was all there. And the gatekeepers then called out, and the news was reported to the king's household there within the city of Samaria. And then we read, jumping to verse 16, "Then the people went out, and they plundered the Aramean camp." Obviously, they were starving. They brought this food back, and God, once again, in His mercy and His grace, delivered His people. But the interesting point is that we have incredible strength and weakness, and that indeed is a New Testament reality. If you go to the New Testament, you read 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 to 27. Brothers, sisters, consider your calling. Not many are wise from a human perspective. Not many powerful. Not many of noble birth. And there he's writing to the Corinthians, many of whom did not come from elite backgrounds. And he says instead, God has chosen the world's foolish things, at least from the world's perspective. Foolish things to shame the wise, and God has chosen the world's weak things to shame the strong. And my mind, of course, goes to the city of Athens, where Paul preached the gospel, and he talked and taught the philosophers there. And they were very wise from a world's point of view, always learning, never coming to knowledge of the truth. And it says that many of these people did not believe. Some believed, but then he went on to Corinth, and I believe in light of his experience in Athens, he told the Corinthians later in this letter that in Athens, where they were wise, they rejected. In Corinth, where you're humble, you're not of elite birth, you're not philosophers, God opened your hearts and you became believers. And so here we have this New Testament reality that God chooses the weak things of this world to confound the wise. In 2 Corinthians, we have Paul's personal experience where he reaffirms this. He said, "To me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness." The background of this is that Paul had this incredible vision, caught up into the third heaven, saw things that he said are unlawful to utter, and because of that, he suffered an affliction. We're not totally sure what this affliction was per se, but it impacted him, and he asked the Lord to remove it, and God didn't. So he's talking about that here in this passage. "Therefore, I will most gladly boast all the more about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may reside in me." Paul felt very weak because of what was happening in his life. And so he says, "I take pleasure in weaknesses, insults, catastrophes, persecutions, and pressures because of Christ." And here's the key phrase. It's a powerful phrase that underscores the principle we're looking at. "For when I am weak, then I am strong." And I think many of us have experienced that in our lives. Doesn't feel good, but on the other hand, many times when we've experienced weakness, go to the Lord, then we experience strength. And so the question is, in what ways does God use our weaknesses today to achieve His purposes in this world? Well, I think one of the things that God achieves through weakness is humility. It puts us on our knees before the Lord. And it causes us to really reach out to God beyond ourselves. We don't feel strong, we feel weak. And we know there's only one solution to the problem, and that is to look to the Lord. It keeps us dependent on the Lord. And I think in some cases, God certainly orchestrates that in our lives to achieve His purposes. He orchestrated it, obviously, in Paul's life, although Paul was a very unique individual. But I think that principle applies more broadly. Now, having said that, I need to say that there are weaknesses, there are tragedies, there are calamities that happen to Christians that are unexplainable. And we certainly would be judgmental if we looked at that and say, what is God trying to teach you through this problem? Because there are certain things that we can't explain why really bad things happen to good people. And it's very judgmental for us to look at people who have afflictions and to judge them and say what we think God's doing in their lives. For example, I think of Johnny Erickson Tada, who was paralyzed because of a serious accident. And it's a horrible experience for her over the years. And yet, she has testified to how her strength has been made perfect in this weakness, and how God has been able to strengthen her and use her in this time of weakness. I think of another person that I interviewed, got to know really well, Paul Lanier, a young medical doctor. Had everything going for him, and he got hit with a horrible disease, Lou Gehrig's disease. And that is a horrible disease. My own brother died of Lou Gehrig's disease. And I saw it just take his body, literally, which became non-functional, all except the brain. That's the interesting thing about that horrible disease. The brain stays strong, intact, and the body just becomes non-functional. And so you're locked into this non-functional body. And it's a horrible death. And this young medical doctor, Paul Lanier, he lived for 9 years, which is unbelievable. And yet, in a book that he wrote, with his eyes and his knees that he could move together with a computer, word by word, literally, letter by letter, wrote a book, The Change of Flight Plan. And in that book talks about how God used this in his life, and he wouldn't exchange this experience. I can't even identify with that. But how God had revealed himself in a way that was unbelievable to him in the midst of his pain and his suffering. I don't understand that. All I know is that God can take that and make it work together for good. And so we must realize that in wrestling with this principle, that we've got to be cautious how we think in terms of how it applies. Even though we may feel weak and unworthy, we should be available for God to use us in miraculous ways to achieve his purposes in the world. That applies to whatever is the cause. Whether it's a direct intervention from God or whether it's part of the sin world in which we live. Because bad things happen to good people. And we can be encouraged by the way that God can take those weaknesses and help people to be strong. And sometimes that's a very difficult tragedy. I just talked recently with a father whose son was involved in the war against terrorism and was seen in action and experienced action and experienced the evil. His best friend died in his arms on the battlefield. And today he has post-traumatic stress, and he's wrestling with why would God allow this to happen. It affected his faith, and yet his parents are believing that somehow he can come to the point where he can accept this as a reality, and it doesn't mean God doesn't care. But the fact of the matter is, it's a Job experience, and hopefully he can come to that point where he says, though he slay me, yet I'll trust him. And Job did not understand what was happening when he said that. So it's a powerful principle. We see it illustrated here in the Old Testament with these 4 leprous men that God chose to use. In their weakness, God gave them strength. And it was real weakness because they just didn't have any hope. But God in his sovereignty gave them hope in the midst of this human tragedy.